Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is the Reading Books in the Bathtub series. This is one of the many episodes that doesn't take place in the bathtub. We're in the bathtub of sorry for the terrible segue, in the bathtub of James Joyce's Ulysses, which is a long bath. It's often a cold bath, and it goes on forever. And every time I read this book, I feel the same way. Why couldn't it be shorter? We are on chapter 16, and again, as they get longer, I think my presentations are going to get shorter, simply because they're too long, and we don't need to cover every single little sentence and clever joke that Joyce produces in these later chapters. They're all much too long. We're on page 704, the long section number 3. If you were following along in Ulysses, which you're not, the actual myth of Ulysses and the Homer's epic of Ulysses, the Odyssey, then you might think about this as the third part of the Odyssey, when Ulysses comes home and meets his son. But don't think about that. This is also the passages where Joyce is almost too self-conscious about that paradigm. In the past, he was playful with it, but he really kind of goes out of his way. He bends things way out of his way to bring up these closing chapters of the Odyssey, closing sections of the Odyssey. Okay, so we've left Nighttown. Stephen is coming to coherence. He's sobering up, and as they're walking along in this kind of bad part of town, Bloom decides to get some food into the guy. He's trying to decide where to send him, whether he should send him back to Sandymount, where he doesn't have a key, and which is a long trip from here. And he's wondering where else to take him. So they go to a cabman's shelter. There was one, when I lived in London, there was a cabman, like one of the last cabman shelters, was right near me in Russell Square. You can still see it there. It's a little tiny, almost a shack, where the guy all night, cabbies could go to have breakfast at almost any hour of the day or night and chat with one another. So this is a Dublin. They eventually go to a Dublin cabman's whatever it is. Cafe or whatever. But first they run into a guy named Lord John Corley, another kind of bum living outside, who came from kind of noble backgrounds, and he doesn't have anywhere to sleep, so Stephen reminds everyone that he doesn't have a place to sleep. And then Bloom and Stephen are starting to get used to one another. This chapter is as we talked about, every narrative chapter is playing a game. And the style of this chapter is one of circumlocution. The circumlocution is simply roundabout way of saying things. So the chapters got long-winded, long paragraphs, which are one sentence, that go on and on forever to say simple things. It's very funny. After 2 pages, after 75 pages, it's not funny anymore. In the midst of this kind of overwrought language, we have Bloom, probably the most emotionally interesting scene in the book, just ruined by this gimmick, and that is when Bloom and Stephen get to know each other. So we go to we go into this cabman's shelter, and we run into a man named W.B. Murphy of Carragalow on 719, page 719, and this old sailor, it's an old sailor, makes a point of he has not seen his wife in 7 years. Okay, this is where Joyce just twists the reality of the story so he can remind us that Ulysses didn't see his wife for 7 years. And we start to talk to him. He starts telling about his various trips. Again, circumlocution is to go around about ways of getting somewhere. And there's a lot of jokes in it about all these different sailors traveling around the world via very complicated routes. So there'll be a lot of talk about all these destinations they take. There's a postcard that shows up that the old sailor gives them to show them, and then what else is going on? We have lots. I won't read them. Page 727 to 728. One of these one paragraph long sentences. He talks about all the different places we've lived in and where we traveled to. And drinking coffee, and Bloom is trying to get Stephen on page 734 to eat something, and Stephen is realizing he hasn't eaten in a couple of days almost, because it's already the next morning. This is well past midnight while they're sitting around. And there's just a lot of stuff about them talking, and there's something interesting. The passages with the sailors is not bad. They're sort of interesting characters, and they sing some songs. And then Bloom and Stephen start to exchange ideas. And Bloom passes on a basically fairly humanistic vision of the world, which is, Stephen is obsessed, like many Catholics, obsessed with good and evil, and whether he's good or evil and what he's done to his mother. And Bloom is saying, we've all got problems. We could all do a lot better, and we could all treat each other better. And Bloom is once he starts talking, he's a pretty nice guy. He's very interested in when the subject of Jews comes up, to impress upon Stephen that the Jews aren't responsible for all the horrible things that many people in Ireland claim they're responsible, and they disagree about many things about Ireland. And at one point on 748, Stephen says, "We can't change the country. Let us change the subject." So there's a brief 3 or 4 page section there where they actually talk about their various different feelings about their country. Then they sit and read the paper for a while, and one of them reads the obituary about Patty Dignam, the funeral that was earlier in the book. There's a fantasy that goes on in Bloom's head about Parnell coming back to Ireland and saving everybody, like Jesus coming back to save all these poor people who he left behind. And this thing goes on quite a while. Eventually, some of these passages are long jokes, too long, and then we get back to the conversation. At one point, Bloom shows Stephen a picture of his wife, Molly, who is described as a very sexy woman to Stephen, and Bloom says to him, she'd love to meet you. And then there's a pause, and obviously on Bloom's mind is she would love to meet you. You're a good-looking guy, and he starts to think of this young son-like person as a rival for his wife, much like every man in town. Okay, on and on. And near about 7:65, Bloom starts thinking, well, maybe I should just bring him home. He can sleep in my house. And then he remembers how once he brought a dog home, a stray mutt, and how upset Molly was about that. And eventually they say, well, we're going to go home. And then they start talking a bit about music. Stephen sings on after a couple of pages of expository prose about singing. Page 773, Stephen sings for a bit, and Bloom recognizes that he has a singing voice like his father. Stephen's father was known for his great voice, and so it turns out Stephen has a wonderful voice. And he thinks, well, Molly will love you because you love music and you're a good-looking kid. And that's really about it. We come to the end of that chapter, and Bloom's taking Stephen home. And again, nothing significant happens. The most significant thing is that these two people get to know each other, and it's almost buried under this joke of circumlocutory prose, in which simple things and simple events are explained in long-winded sentences. We were sort of here in the same place before with the citizen, and it's not any better this time. Okay, now we're going to go on to the next one, which is another way of taking the two most emotional passages in the book are Stephen and Bloom getting to know each other, and Joyce does everything he can to just nullify every emotional resonance in this scene. And you got to dig for them. They're there, but you got to look for them. And the next scene is like a 100-page logical argument. So there'll be a question and an answer, and it's like this endless syllogism. So we'll talk about that next. And again, this chapter's not as bad as I think some of them, but it is pretty slow. And as usual, the last 10, 20 pages, the last part of the chapters are always the most painful. So you got to go through it a bit. You got to pay a lot of attention to the first 2/3 of that chapter. And then at the last part, they talk a lot about music. Stephen sings, and then they head towards Bloom's house. All right, take care. We're almost done. 2 more chapters. Bye.